Now that we kind of have it narrowed down to the year, or about a 10-month span, we're going to try to zero in and figure out, when was he actually born? I mentioned last week that the stars are put there by God, and although there's been corruption over the years with different cultures and stuff, their original meaning, God says that he named the stars. And so in Genesis 3, we have the first messianic prophecy when the Lord was cursing the serpent. He said, the seed of the woman, he shall bruise her head, and you shall bruise his heel, to the serpent. And we see this recurring theme in the constellations, in the signs, of an enemy being under the foot of a heroic figure. So on the left there, nowadays we call that a rabbit. We could call it used to be known as an enemy. The scorpion, obviously a villainous figure also. And then on the right, we have Draco, which is a dragon or a serpent. And you can see it has a snake-like appearance, and it's under the foot of Hercules. So his heel is on the head of the serpent. In Job 26:13, we read, by his spirit, he adorned the heavens. He decorated the heavens. He put the stars there. And then this is a couplet. He goes on to say, his hand pierced the fleeing serpent. That's how it's rendered in English. I have some of the words here that are found in the Septuagint. So for serpent, we have Draco, Draconta. That means dragon. So that seems to be a reference specifically to this constellation, because he's speaking of putting stars in the heavens. And then the word fleeing there, you can see that word looks like our English word apostate. That means like defected or gone astray. So fleeing is an appropriate translation there. And then the word pierced, that's athanatosin, that in bold there, so that's a verb based on a noun, thanatos, which means death. So to turn that into a verb, that means to put to death, to kill, to strike a deadly blow. So if you might think this looks like the Marvel character who's a villain named Thanos, that's not a coincidence. His name is a shortened version of this Greek word for death. Before that passage, we have this reference to the woman and her seed. And so in the sign of Virgo, Virgo in Latin means virgin. There's another Latin word, virga, which means branch. And these two words seem to be related. They don't really have a strong connection in English, but in Latin, you can see they're very similar. Likewise, the Hebrew name for this sign was Bethula, and the same word in Aramaic also means branch. So there's some connection there. Now, the brightest star in Virgo is called Spica, and that means spike, or in English, we tend to say ear of corn or wheat, a grain, right? So our word ear has a Germanic root, but that also means spike. We could say a spike of corn, but we say ear of corn because some of our language comes from German rather than Latin.
Oh,
and in Hebrew, this same star is called Zamak, which means branch. That word, Zamak, is used 4 times in the Old Testament, referring to the coming Messiah. In Jeremiah 23:5, we read, behold, the days are coming, says the Lord, that I will raise to you a branch of righteousness. A king shall reign and prosper and execute judgment and righteousness in the earth. And this is echoed later in Jeremiah also. That word king is Melech, and the word righteousness is Zedek. Those are the same names as Regulus and Jupiter. So, we're talking about a king of righteousness again. In Zechariah 3:8, we read, my servant, the branch. In Zechariah 6:12, we read, behold the man whose name is branch. And in Isaiah 4:2, we read, in that day, the branch of the Lord shall be beautiful and glorious. So for those of you who have been here for the last several months, do these 4 roles ring any bells? King, servant, man, Lord.
4 Gospels.
That's right. So when we were going through the Gospels, we pointed out that the creatures that surround God's throne have these 4 faces. They have the face of a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle. And we talked about how those symbolize these 4 roles of king, servant, man, and God, and how each of the 4 Gospels corresponds to one of those roles in the way Jesus is presented. For instance, in Matthew, his royal lineage is given. We see Joseph's perspective. We're told about how he's a descendant of David through all the kings back to Abraham. Whereas in Luke, we get his genealogy, his natural genealogy, going all the way back to Adam because he's the son of man. In Mark, there is no genealogy because the servant's genealogy is of no importance. And in John, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. So that's presenting Jesus as Lord. So in Haggai chapter 2, in verses 6 and 7, we read that they shall come to the desire of the nations. That's a reference to the Messiah, where he's called the desire of all nations. The constellation pictured beside Virgo there, the Hebrew name for that was Coma. And today, we don't look at it as a woman with child, but it used to be. So the Hebrew word that's desire up in Haggai 2:7 is like the noun version based on this verb that means to long for. So it's like the object of longing or desire. So this is one where there's a thread that you can follow where today, this constellation, so each of the signs has 3 associated constellations. They're called decans sometimes. So you have a sign plus 3 constellations that are associated with it. And this is the first of Virgo's signs, and it's this child, which is kind of weird, right? You have a virgin and a young child. Well, today, if you look at constellation labels, it's called Coma Berenices, which means Bernice's hair. So they've replaced this child with a head of hair. And the reason for it, I'm going to just summarize it. This was an intentional corruption. In the 3rd century BC in Alexandria, Bernice, was she a queen?
Bernice
was
queen, yeah.
Ptolemy III's wife. Someone stole her wig. And an astrologer claimed that Jupiter put it in the stars. And there's a similar word, right? So the Hebrew word, and by the way, as you know, we've talked about the Septuagint. In the 3rd century BC, there's a lot of interaction between Jews and Greeks, right? They're translating the Septuagint. There's a lot of cultural interaction.
Right.
So this word coma is very similar to a Greek word that means head of hair. That's where we get our word comet, means long-haired planet. It comes from that same word comi. And then, the Bernice part, just that means bearer of victory. Our word Nike for the shoes means victory, and bearer, right? So her name means bringer of victory. So they added that to it, but the coma, they took a similar, kind of like a homonym, and they turned it into, that means head of hair. So that's where that comes from. But going back thousands of years, even in Egypt, this constellation was known as Shesnu, the desired son. The image there, that's copied from an ancient temple in Egypt. In this case, we can trace how it was corrupted. There's a historical record of that. So that's one example of, some of these constellations where they've shifted from their original meaning, either unintentionally or intentionally. In Revelation 12, we read, "Now a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a garland of 12 stars. Then, being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. She bore a male child who was to rule all nations with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up to God and his throne." Now, this imagery here, the sun and the moon and the 12 stars, anytime you see 12, that's a hint that this is likely referring to something related to Israel with the 12 tribes. And back in Genesis 37, Joseph described this dream where there were the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. And his father Jacob, Israel, said, "Am I and your mother," so the sun and the moon, "and your brothers, the 11 stars, to bow down to you?" So this symbolism seems to be a callback to that. But on the other hand, we're talking about a woman who is about to give birth. And so this could be a clue. Remember in Genesis, it says that the stars were given for signs and for years and seasons, that this could be a clue of when Jesus was actually born. We're talking about a woman about to give birth. The way the stars can be used as a calendar you've got these 12 signs that are along the path of the sun. And so the sun will cycle through these. So if you say, I'm a Scorpio, well, that means that you were born when the sun looked like it was in Scorpio, which happens for about a month in November. Then the next month, it's moved on to the next sign. So you can't see the stars when the sun's out, but you would see this at sunrise or sunset. Just like we saw the sun rising in Leo, right? So that would happen for about a month. And then the next month, it would be on to Virgo, actually. So if we have this imagery of the woman, say that Virgo, the virgin, being clothed in the sun, that means that it's going to be in the month where the sun is where her clothes would be. So that yellow line marks the span of where the sun is in Virgo in September. Okay, so that kind of narrows it down, right? Now all we have to do is get the moon to be at her feet, because the moon cycles about every month. So we're going to look in September, and we're going to look at when the moon is under her feet. And we know from Luke 2 that he was born at night, or at least after the sun went down, because the Jewish days begin at sundown. And we read that the angel came to shepherds who were watching over their flock by night. So this was at night. And he said, there is born to you this day in the city of David a Savior who is Christ the Lord. So he was referring to that night, that as, that day. So we kind of have it narrowed down to the early part of the night. A couple other things I just wanted to note here. A little bit of myth busting, because we have all these images, like we talked last week, like the wise men didn't arrive the night of, right? It was months later. And that's very clear, because when they're in Jerusalem, it says after he was born. We're not told how long after, but when they got to Jerusalem, before they went to Bethlehem, he was already born. And here, we have that Mary and Joseph traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem for the census. That was about 100 miles. And so it was that while they were there, the days were completed for her to be delivered. So oftentimes you'll see it portrayed like they barely got into Bethlehem and she's going into labor. They were already there, it seems, from this reading, that it was while they were there that she went into labor. It wasn't like a last minute thing. And then this kind of like reinforces that myth, is that this translation about there being no room for them in the inn, that word that's translated as in a lot of Bibles, it's used elsewhere in Luke and also in Mark 14, kind of like the same story of Jesus talking about where they were going to eat the Passover. He says, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? And so this guest room is like in a house, you would have, maybe an upper room or maybe a room off to the side that was used for guests, right? So Joseph, being that Bethlehem is his hometown, his family's town, it seems like it's much more likely that rather than, oh, by the way, they weren't particularly wealthy, because when they presented Jesus at the temple, they took the cheaper option of sacrificing 2 turtle doves rather than a lamb. That's indication number one that the Magi hadn't been there yet, because that would come months later. They didn't have a stash of gold. And number two, they probably wouldn't have been so likely, especially, if you might be giving birth, to want to stay in a public inn when they are in a town where he's got family. So more likely here, they were in Joseph's home, but there may have been other family members, and who knows how many, occupying that room. And so they would have been displaced from the guest room and maybe in a place where the animals would come in for the night. Could be similar to today, where you might have like a mudroom or a garage, a stable area of that home. But it wasn't like they tried to go to the Holiday Inn and it's full, and they found some random stable next door. I mean, this was some stabling area of the family, Joseph's family. Privacy, right? Right. You might not want to be in a guest room with a dozen family members, and so they were in a place where they would stable the animals at night, and that's why there's this manger wherever she was. So we looked at this. I'm going to take off the artwork, and this is a different rendering. It looks more like a person than what is shown with the artwork, but I can't show both. So from now on, we're going to look at the dots and lines. So this is in the western sky. She kind of goes into the horizon head first. In the eastern sky, she'd be upright, and then as she comes over, now she's sort of diving into the horizon. So this is how things would look on September 9th as you're approaching sunset. It's really hard to see, but there's a moon. It's like a new moon there.
Mm-hmm. But it's not at her feet.
Right. So this is an astronomical new moon. And because it's hard to see, because it's black on black, I'm going to blow up the moon tenfold. Is that better?
Sure.
Okay. So when we talk about a new moon today, we talk about it from an astronomical point of view, which is the point where the moon, as it's traveling along this path, where it kind of passes the sun, where if they're overlapping, there would be an eclipse. But in this case, you wouldn't even see it because by the time the sun sets, the moon is already set, right? So the way that the Jews would do their lunar calendar, when they had the first day of the month would be when the first crescent shows. And so the next day, this is what it looked like. The moon's basically still in complete darkness. On the 11th, you get just a hint of light visible along the right there. But this would be what they would call the eve of the new moon. And then the next day, this is now where you have like an actual visible crescent. And look, it's right under her feet. And so this is the day that I propose that this is the night that Jesus was born. So looking at it again with the atmosphere on, so you get the effect of sunlight because, they were turned off for those other images. This is, again, September 11th, the eve of the new moon. You can barely see the moon there, but the next night, this would be what would be called the first of the month. So let's just look at it as it's setting in 15-minute intervals. So I shrunk it down to 5 times there so that it's not under the horizon there. And then this is what it looks like, again, in real scale. It's hard to see. That's why I blew it up. But this is just to see like the scale that it would actually be. And as you can see, it's under her feet. If you drew a line between her feet, it would be there. The next day, it would be kind of like well into Libra and so on, right? I mean, we looked at how it would track from day to day. So I propose that Jesus was born on the night of Tishri 1, which is the Hebrew New Year.
Yes.
It's the Feast of Trumpets in Leviticus 23. It's also known as Rosh Hashanah, which means head of the year. That's, like New Year. And it's, according to Jewish tradition, the anniversary of Adam's creation. So this would have corresponded to day 6 of creation. Also, we're told specifically in Genesis 8:13 that the first day of the first month is when the flood ended. Now, sometimes this is called the 7th month, and that's because the Hebrew calendar, kind of like we have a school year and a calendar year, that the school year goes from summer to summer and the calendar year goes winter to winter. They had the civil year, which is this one that starts in the fall, and then they had an ecclesiastical year that started in the spring. And those 2 months are feast months. We've talked about the month in the spring, Nisan, which is, again, sometimes the first, sometimes the 7th month, that those feasts were fulfilled in Christ's crucifixion. He was crucified when the Passover lamb was crucified. He was in the tomb uncorrupted during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. He rose with the Feast of First Fruits, and then 10 days after the Ascension, you had the outpouring of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. And so now we look at the fall feasts, and you have Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets. This is also associated with kings and their reigns, that they would count the years of their reign. They would tick it up on Rosh Hashanah. So if you were the king a month before, and then Rosh Hashanah happens, now you're in your 2nd year of your reign, right? So that's kind of the reference point. And I think they would do this for ages too. So when Herod says, when he's trying to figure out from the Magi when that first star appeared, which was a month before this, that would have been like last year at the time. That would have been in June, and he's talking about the previous August before Rosh Hashanah. And so he had all the children under 2 years slaughtered in Bethlehem. So he would have considered someone born in August in their 2nd year. So that fits. Even though Jesus wouldn't have been a full year old, he still would have been, if he had been assumed to have been born before Rosh Hashanah, to try to cast a net wide enough to get him, it makes sense that he would have done 2 years and younger.
Yeah.
But technically,
it wasn't a chronological year. It was a calendar.
Well, in their, yeah, right. They didn't,
Like a yearling, like a horse.
right, they didn't look at it from your actual birthday, but, what calendar year. So, like, if you were born in November, in January, now you're in your second year.
Yeah.
That's kind of like how they would do it, except the tick up would be in September. The next day, or really even by September 12th, you're coming into that first conjunction of Jupiter and Regulus that we looked at, where it was kind of going back and forth. So it's just heading into that right at this time also. At sundown on September 21st, this is day 10 of Tishri. That is the Day of Atonement. It might kind of correspond to like the 8th day when Jesus was circumcised, but it doesn't seem to be exact. But then you have, beginning on the 15th of the month, you have the Feast of Tabernacles. And in John 1:14, which I mentioned earlier, where it says the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, that Greek word dwelt really means tabernacled or tented. So it could be that the Feast of Tabernacles is referring to Jesus becoming flesh. He became flesh and tabernacled among us. So it seems like similar to the way the spring feasts, and by the way, okay, so this month now with his birth is associated with Virgo, right? Aries, which is a ram or perhaps a lamb, is associated with Nisan, the Passover month. So it just seems to line up so well. You have, all of the, where Jesus is the sacrifice, that happens in the month of the ram, just like the ram that took Isaac's place in Genesis 22. And in fall, when he was born, that's the month of Virgo, the Virgin. So here is a second witness making the case that Jesus was born in September, our September. So in Luke 1, we're told that John the Baptist's father, Zacharias, if you recall, he was serving as a priest when the angel told him that his wife was going to conceive, and because of his unbelief, he was struck mute. So we're told that he was a division of Abijah. It seems like kind of, to us, that's something you'd read and you might just kind of gloss over because that doesn't mean much to us. But if you dig into it, you find in First Chronicles, you have where there was a schedule, kind of like a batting order given of who was to serve the divisions of the Levites, who was to serve each week. So they would go from Sabbath to Sabbath, and they would go through these. And they're given an order here where Abijah is number 8 out of 24 divisions. And so in their calendar, which is a lunar calendar, they had 51 weeks. You had 24. They would go through this cycle twice. And then you have 3 weeks left, and those were the Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. The 3, sometimes they're called pilgrim feasts because all the men had to go to Jerusalem on those feasts. And on those 3 feasts, they would all do it together. It wasn't an individual priest, but they would sort of combine.
The whole group of Abijah would go together?
Not just the whole, all 24. They would all serve together. Those were like festival weeks, right? They were special. So you had 2 cycles of 24, and intermixing them, you would have a week where it was everybody. So then you would pick up where you left off. So if you look at in 4 BC, which would be based on what we've already kind of laid out, the year that we would think this would take place. And this started, again, this is the ecclesiastical year, so we're using Nisan in the spring as the starting point. And so if you go to the Sabbath before the first of Nisan, that would be where this cycle begins. Then the 8th course would be the 8th week plus 1, because Passover's in there too. So it's like the 9th week after that. You end up in late May. So Zacharias is serving, he's struck mute, which now he can't fulfill his duties. Leviticus 21, verse 16 to 23 lays that out. And so he goes home, and not long after that, within a week or a month, his wife conceives. And that would place that in June, right? So we start in late May is when Zacharias was serving in the temple, and he goes home. In June, his wife gets pregnant. In December, Mary, who has newly conceived Jesus within her, visits, and John the Baptist sleeps in the womb. So that's 6 months later. And then that would put John the Baptist's birth in March, and then in August, we have the star in the east. September now, 9 months after their meeting in December, that we're into when Jesus was born. So based on when John the Baptist's father served in the temple, it also points to September. So it's always good to have a second witness, a second line of evidence pointing not as precisely as having this position of the sun and moon, but we could at least narrow it down, probably more like that picture of September 1st to 30th, so somewhere in that range. So this is consistent with that. Now you might say, what about the other time that he would have served? Because this comes up twice a year. That would have been about 6 months off of that. And that would have been in the spring during the rainy season. So if you want people to travel to their hometown for a census, the rainy season is not an ideal time to do that. So between the two of them, the fall would be a more likely time for this set of circumstances to happen than in the spring.
When he was born in September 12th, wasn't it customary 8 days later to go to the temple?
Well, that wouldn't have had to be at the temple. They could have done that locally in Bethlehem, but he was presented at the temple on the 40th day, which was when they sacrificed those 2 turtle doves. Mm-hmm. And then, so that was several months before the Magi showed up with their expensive gifts. And then, very shortly after that, maybe the night of, Mary and Joseph fled to Egypt because they were warned by an angel of the danger through Herod's plot to slaughter.
How are you arriving at June 17th being the date that the Magi traveled?
That was the second day that the conjunction happened.
Okay.
So that one's like pretty well locked in, right?
Okay.
And so, maybe like that night or the following night or something like that. Not long after that, because we read that Herod, when he realizes he was deceived by the Magi, because he's like, tell us when you find him, because we want to worship him. But they were wise to him. And so they went a different route when they left. And so when he's waiting around for them and doesn't get it, that's when he orders the slaughter. So it might not have been the next day, but within a short period of time, the angel warned them to flee to Egypt.
So Jesus was about 9 months old?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and then when they came back, they didn't settle in Bethlehem. They went back to Nazareth. And there's some passage in there that kind of makes it sound like that Bethlehem might have been their first choice. But because of I forget his name, who was reigning then, there still would have been a danger. If you show up in Bethlehem a couple years after everyone that age has been killed, that wouldn't be the wisest place to resettle because, you're going to like, oh, that's weird. There's no other 3-year-olds, right? So they went back to Nazareth where they could just blend in and not call attention to themselves.
With, right?
What's that?
No kids to play with.
Well, there were... Well, it'd be more like someone might out them, right?
Right.
Like
But
all.
still,
Yeah,
if
I
you went
mean,
back there, there's where they
You go
Yeah.
to school and you're the only one in your grade.
Yeah, you're the only first grader. Yeah. So also we haven't talked about Herod the Great, the one that ordered the slaughter. Oftentimes the birth of Jesus is placed before 4 BC because there's a popular argument that Herod the Great died in 4 BC. And that's based largely on the writings of Josephus talk about an eclipse, a lunar eclipse that happened, and then some stuff happened, and then the Passover. And in 4 BC, in March, 1 month before the Passover, because Passover was a full moon, 1 month before there was a lunar eclipse. But there's so many events that would have had to take place, it should be more than a month, because there's a lot of traveling, and Herod was sick, and he tries to go to this place to, go to these springs, and there's a lot of stuff to cram into 1 month. Whereas in 1 BC, December 29th, so right before you turn over to AD 1, there was a lunar eclipse, and this one was in the moonrise, whereas the one in 4 BC was in the middle of the night. Not many people would have seen it, but if a lunar eclipse happens as the moon is rising, a lot of people would see it. And now you have, from December to would have been probably late March, now you have 3 months for those events to happen. So that seems more likely. And there's some other evidence, too, supporting that Herod would have died in 1 AD, not in 4 BC. Because of that misconception, now when people look for these events of what the Magi saw, they're not looking in 3 BC or 2 BC, they're looking prior to that. And this also puts it now our dating system, which is meant to be based on when Jesus was born, we're only off by a couple of years, not 6 or 7 years. So it all seems to fit better that Herod's death is later than is often concluded.